Mother Tongue by Padma Sachdev. I approached a stem swinging on a reed and asked him to give me a quill. Irritated, he said, "I gave you one only the other day, a new one. What have you done with it?" At a period when we're all worried about certain languages becoming endangered, might come as a shock to many of you. How can we talk about languages being endangered? But remember, like the species, like the dinosaur disappeared, and ever so many today we even look at the tiger probably as endangered. What does it mean? That gradually their numbers are reducing. And when we talk about a language being endangered, what we mean is that fewer and fewer people are speaking that language till we may reach a stage where nobody speaks that anymore. And in India, I believe, according to the census, there are 191 languages which are in that category. Vulnerable, endangered, very endangered, etc. Some of them we've never heard of. I was amused by a name like Vishnupriya Manipuri. That is the name of the language. And then you have Gondi and you have Aitan. As I told you, there are 191 languages. But the poem that we are looking at today has been written in the Dogri language. The Dogri language is spoken in some parts of Jammu. And we have today Mother Tongue by Padma Sachdev. This poem, Mother Tongue, helps us look at poems which come from parts of India in languages which we are not very familiar with. Padma Sachdeva, 1940 to 2021, is a novelist and a poet. We are looking at her as a poet in the Dogri language, but she also wrote in Hindi. She has been awarded the Padma Shri and the Sahitya Academy. Naturally, the poem that we are looking at today is a poem in translation. If some of us could read some of these lesser known languages, I think it would really show us the variety, the diversity of languages in India. But of course, today our poem is an English translation of a poem originally written in the Dogri language. Mother tongue. What does the word mean to most of us? It means the language, the first language that we heard, that we learned to speak, even when we were in the lap of our mother. And that is why each child learns the language which it is most exposed to, most easily. No rules of grammar for such a child when it picks up the first language. This poem is about the mother tongue. And you need a little imagination to understand this poem. Should I be saying to appreciate this poem? Because a lot of poems is not only about understanding. It's also about appreciating. It's also about empathizing. So the poem begins with, "I approached a stem swinging on a reed and asked him to give me a quill." So you need a little imagination. Who is the poet speaking to? The poet is speaking to a stem, right? So you have to go out into the garden and we have our flowers which are on stems. And why does she want it? Because she wants to write. She wants a quill. Remember, much before we had our pens, and even today, many of the youngsters would know only the ball pen or whatever we call it today. But when I was a kid, we had the ink pen. And if you're going even earlier, you might have seen it in movies, for example, we had the feather. You know, they would use a feather, the back side of the feather, one end of the feather, dip it into ink or paint and write. So we are talking about that period when people used quills. So our poet goes into the garden and asks for a reed. Why does she need it? She says, "Because I want to write." And the stem is a little irritated, angry, and says, "I just gave you one yesterday. What did you do with it? Why do you want one again today? And then there is a little hitting out ad. What do people usually write? They probably only keep their accounts, your debit and credit signs on your balance sheet. And so she says, the poet says that, the quill says, the reed says, the stem says, you can use these synonyms. Are you an accountant with some Shah writing account books? Right? So referring to that entire community which is involved in keeping accounts. And then she says, the answer is very interesting. She says, no, I don't work for a Shah, but I work for a Shahni. Okay, a word she's probably invented because she's looking at the muse. I'm sure you've heard of the muse, and you've got 9 muses according to European mythology. So we have a muse of poetry, and the muse is female, is feminine, is a woman, and therefore she says, I work for a Shahni. And here, very beautifully, the poet calls herself a servant. So who is the Shahini? The Shahini is the language. And the poet is a mere servant or slave of the language. So she thinks of herself as serving the language by writing in that language. As I told you in the introduction, there are endangered languages. Of course, Dogri is not in that category, but we must remember that unless we keep our languages alive, and how do we keep them alive? By writing in them, by talking in them, by exchanging our ideas in them to make sure that no language becomes extinct. So she says, once I have a reed, I can continue to write. Give me a quill quickly, she says. I must go because my mistress is waiting for me. The muse of poetry is waiting for me, and I must go and write because I am her servant. What is the poem all about? The importance of keeping our languages alive. This poem is very conversational in tone, and therefore you have 2 speakers. One is the poet and one is the reed or the stem or the quill, as I mentioned earlier. The poet tells us what the answer is. So you don't have, it's not as if you have it in inverted commas. So you have the poet saying something and then the answer of the stem also being narrated by the poet. So it's very conversational, and therefore there is no rhyme scheme. I can't talk about whether it's a tercet or a sestet. We don't have any of that. The structure also is that of a conversation. What is important is, as you read the poem aloud, you must realize that you have to stop at the places where the poet stops speaking and the stem starts speaking. So, asked him to give me a quill, and then the poem goes on, instead he said. And then you know that it is the quill speaking. Isn't it strange? Every time I talk about a poem, I talk to you about the importance of the figures of speech. And here we have a poem where it's almost possible for me to say that there are no figures of speech, except of course one, which is personification. Because remember, the stem speaks to us. The stem is almost human in nature. So that is the only figure of speech that you will find in this poem. The poem should spur us into looking at other poems in the Dogri language. It should spur us into looking at other languages around us of which we are not even aware. Sometimes even the name of the language may seem strange to you. I live in Gujarat, and I'm often intrigued by the fact when a student comes up to me and says, I'm learning Gujarati. And I say, why are you learning Gujarati? And he says, I speak Gamit at home. So Gamit is a dialect. And remember, it would be interesting also to see what is different from a dialect and a language. What is the difference? So I think our homework for the day could be looking at the languages around us of which we are not even aware. Probably looking at dialects and asking yourself, did the dialect come from the language or the language come from the dialect? I leave you with that question. and don't forget to look for the answer. Hope you enjoyed looking at this poem, listening to me about a poem in the Dogri language.
No, I don't work for a Shah, I said, but for a Shani. Very kind, very well off, and I'm not the only one working for her. She has many servants ever ready to do her bidding. That Shani is my mother tongue, Dogri. Give me a quill quickly. She must be looking for me. The reed cut off its hand, gave it to me, and said, "Take it. I too am her servant."